Thank you, Noah. So I want to welcome you back. This was a really extraordinary session that we just experienced with Heather, and speaking to equity, but also speaking really strongly to solutions. And I've so appreciated Heather bringing up the question of faith, how important her Christian faith is, and also that is something that she trusts deeply. She also brought into focus issues related to the relationship between people, systems, and rebuilding trust. So in introducing Dekila, I just want to share some words from an old friend of mine, Sulak Shivaraksha, who is a socially engaged Buddhist from Thailand. And he's written, Buddhism is not concerned just with private destiny. Buddhism is not concerned just with private destiny, but with the lives and consciousness of all beings. Any attempt to understand Buddhism apart from its social dimension, and I would say environmental as well, is fundamentally a mistake. And then he points the finger strongly at us because there's such a emphasis in Western Buddhism on personal psychology, which is important, but he says, until Western Buddhists understand this, their embrace of Buddhism will not help very much in the efforts to bring about meaningful and positive social change. And he then ends this little rap of his, he says, or even in their struggle to transform their ego. So Sulak takes no prisoners. Actually, that's a terrible thing to say, but he's very outspoken about how important it is for us to understand that we are part of a bigger system, and that bigger system on this earth and the very atmosphere that supports us is essential for the continuity of life of all beings. So I met Dekila Chungyalpa, and Dekila, I think I misspelled your name somewhere. I know you'll forgive me. We're old friends, but sorry, it's, thank you, my good buddy. So I met Dekila in a very important meeting in Dharamsala with His Holiness the Dalai Lama and a group of very extraordinary people involved in environmental science and ethos. And Dekila, I believe you gave the last presentation, and I was moderating your presentation. I was so thrilled to see this young woman compared to His Holiness or to me, speaking so brilliantly about issues related to climate education, and also the work that you have done with the World Wildlife Fund, now at the University of Wisconsin-Madison with the Loka Initiative, around the very issues that we're addressing today. And one of the things that I love about you, Heather, and also Kriti and Rhonda, is that you have done direct work, working in cultures who are at the mercy of environmental changes, being a bridge person to cultural transformation and social transformation in those cultures. And that is very much a part of what the Loka Initiative is doing. I just want to mention a few other things about you. You were awarded the prestigious McCluskey Fellowship at Yale School of Forestry and environmental studies, and also the work that you did in East Africa and the Eastern Himalayas, the work on the Mekong in the Amazon. It's just been a kind of platform where so many of us have learned about solutions to issues related to inequity and environmental justice. So my dear friend, welcome. I'm just so grateful you're with us today. And
Thank you.
on you go.
Thank you so much, Roshila. The meeting that Roshi was referring to was actually 10 years ago. So that's how long Roshi and I've been interconnecting and reconnecting. And Roshi has been a great source of support for me in the last 10 years. And I'm so happy to be part of the Upaya community again. I like to show slides just because I always feel that the work is much more, it's much more important that you see the work, I think, than just hear me talk. So let me try doing this and tell me if you can see my slides. Is everyone seeing the Loka? Is everyone seeing this? Okay, great, wonderful. So Dekila, everybody. I would like to start by expressing my gratitude to the Ho-Chunk people. I am in the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk people in Madison, Wisconsin. One of the things I loved and one of the reasons why it was an easy choice for me to move here was because the land that we live in is called Tijop in the Ho-Chunk language, which actually refers to the sacred lakes of Wisconsin. And I actually come from a land in Sikkim in the Himalayas that also has a lot of sacred lakes. And when I arrived here, there was this really strong emotional connection for me. And so I have a very deep gratitude to the Ho-Chunk people for taking care and for teaching all of us who've gone through the Western system how to actually dissolve the dualism that we imbibe as being part of the Western education paradigm and live and breathe and understand and absorb the meaning of kinship and interdependence. And then I thought I'd start by talking about where I come from. So I come from Sikkim in the Eastern Himalayas. And the mountain, the image that you're looking at is Mount Kanchenjunga. In my language, we would pronounce it Kangsujeonga. So Kanchenjunga is the third highest peak on the planet. However, I am guessing most of you don't know that and have never heard of it. And there's a reason why. That's because for the indigenous people of Sikkim, so the Lepcha people, the Bhutia, which is what my family is, and for the Tsong and the Limbu, Kangsujeonga is real. He's living. He is our protective deity. We will never allow him to be climbed. We turned down, as you can imagine, thousands of lucrative offers for climbing expeditions. And to us, it would be sacrilegious that someone would climb our living deity, our protective deity, and put a flag on it and claim to own it in some way, right? Claim some kind of victory over nature. And when I heard Roshi talk about it, I heard Heather talk about it, you know, when we talk about why 80% of biodiversity exists in indigenous lands, it's really important to bring it back to the reason being that our worldview begins with the concept of interdependence and kinship, which means nature is alive and nature has intrinsic value and nature has as many rights as we humans do. And that this is, this is the basis for why indigenous peoples put their bodies on the line time and again, are doing it right now as we speak in the North with Line 3, right? Time and again, everywhere around the world, because they believe nature has equal rights to exist and to be protected. Now, I went on to study environment. I knew from a really young age that I was going to be an environmentalist. I deeply love forests. I loved wildlife. I grew up in an area where there were wild bears. And so I always knew I was going to work for an environmental organization. And I was lucky. I went on to work for WWF. When I started in 2000, my work was completely on community-based conservation. Because of my background, I believe that empowering local communities was the most important thing you could do to work on environmental issues, and it is. However, one of the things that happened while I was doing this work was this gradual realization that the scope and the scale of environmental issues, particularly climate issues, was just so large that I started feeling this sense of panic and concern that the work I was doing wasn't big enough. And so this image is from 2007. I was working in the Mekong region, and WWF was very good to me. I was their youngest conservation director for the WWF office, and I managed their Greater Mekong portfolio. And we were working at a river basin level, connecting 5 countries, working with 5 governments, right? Working with all these multinationals and local communities. And the same experience came to me. I started not being able to sleep at night. I started having panic attacks. I started being really stressed out all the time, because for those of us who work in the field, or who are scientists, who are actually spending all our time looking at the data, the information was really damning. What it felt like was that I was walking in these forests and I could, in some sense, see that they were dead or dying, because the change was coming so rapidly, whether it was in terms of climate change, or whether it was in terms of extraction or landscape changes, right? Or wildlife poaching and being part of the wildlife trade. So again, I was in this state of acute despair. We now have a term for it. It's called eco-anxiety. But in 2007, I'd never heard of this thing. And so all I knew was that me and all my peers, all my friends, my community of conservationists, we were just in this state of despair all the time. Now, in this state of mind, I was invited by my family to go to Bodh Gaya, whom many of you probably know. It's the #1 pilgrimage site for Buddhists. It's where Buddha was enlightened. And I was invited to come during Kagyu Manlam, which is my community's Karma Kagyu Buddhist. My family is very staunchly Karma Kagyu Buddhist. And I heard His Holiness the Karmapa speak. And it was the first time I was meeting him and talking about environmental issues. And I didn't expect this to happen, but he asked me to create environmental guidelines for my community, the Karma Kagyu Buddhists, right? All these monasteries and nunneries. And of course I said yes. I love to joke about it, but the truth was, my first thought was, this takes care of my next lifetime. And from this very selfish motivation, I began working with the monks and nuns. Now, I thought what I was asked to do was create guidelines, hand it over to the monks and nuns, and then go about my business being a field conservationist and manager, right? Instead, what happened was the feedback from the monks and the nuns, all these monastics spread across the Himalayas, was so strong that I was forced to stop what I was doing and pay attention to them, because they had for the first time been given an explanation of what was happening outside the window. For the first time, they understood that what climate change was, why all of a sudden these valleys were experiencing drought, why other places were experiencing floods, what was happening with temperature rising, what was happening with the price of apples, for example. All of this came together for them. And what was amazing to me was how quickly that transformed into a desire to do something about it. And I basically was watching self-motivated leaders in the community decide that environmental issues and climate change was their problem. And in the 10, 12 years preceding that, my job was to go around trying to convince all these people in the government, in the corporations, in the private sector that this was their problem, and couldn't get them to care most of the time. And here there was this self-selected group of environmentalists that emerged. And the work they went on to do was incredible, right? So very measurable kinds of changes. Everything, all these monasteries, now we have over 50 monasteries across the Himalayas doing this work. Reforestation of indigenous saplings, messaging on the importance of wildlife protection, doing community cleanups once a month and demonstrating to local communities that what happens in the community really matters to the monks and nuns. Turning all of their flower gardens into organic farming. I just spoke with one of the heads of Pulahari Monastery in Nepal, and he said that during the pandemic, 1/3 of their vegetable use is coming from their own garden. That's how expansive their transformation of their lands has been. And then interestingly, a real focus on disaster management. So for those of you who know the Himalayas, you know that our waters come from the Tibetan Plateau. Tibet is warming 2 times faster than the rest of the world. And we know that our landscape is incredibly fragile as it is. We're in a seismic zone. Everest is still growing. And so having the monks and nuns decide that they want to be a hub for disaster preparedness for their communities was this incredible moment. And so for the last 5 years, that's been what these monasteries and nunneries have been doing, to the point where they now are training other communities, including non-monastic communities, on how to be prepared for disasters. And what you're looking at is what's called a CERT training, which is a community emergency response training. So we now have hundreds of monks and nuns who can, take the robes and turn it into a stretcher in 5 minutes, that can apply first aid, that know how to be first responders and how to evacuate people from rubble and from broken down buildings and so on. So there was a real practical transformation that happened and that I got to be witness to and help train the monasteries for. However, my work kept continuing with WWF. Now, because the WWF is the largest conservation group in the world, we have this network of conservation directors all around the world. And so the feedback I started getting from them was, why are you only doing this in the Himalayas? Why aren't we working with faith leaders in other parts of the world? Especially the response from Africa was very strong, where 9 out of 10 Africans identify themselves as deeply religious, not just faithful, not just spiritual, but deeply religious, right? So armed with the practical experience and then the requests coming in from these field offices, I went to the WWF board and was able to convince them using these facts and figures. 85% of the people on the planet follow a religion. 80% of biodiversity is in indigenous managed lands. Faith owns collectively 8% of all habitable land surface. Something most people don't think of, they constitute the world's 3rd largest category of financial investors. So here are all these very practical reasons, right? Why we as scientists, we in the environmental science communities should care about faith. WWF allowed me to create a program, what Roshi mentioned earlier, allowed me to create a program called Sacred Earth, where what I did for 5 years was work with faith leaders in East Africa, in the Amazon, in the Mekong, in the United States, to basically demonstrate that working with faith leaders moved the needle in areas that we were stuck, in areas where we were having problems addressing the issue. We were actually able to engage faith leaders and have their influence sort of move us forward, right? Take us 5 steps forward where we were previously paralyzed. And so the 2 examples I would love to give, one is in East Africa. We were able to bring 50 faith leaders representing 50 faith institutions around Africa on the issue of wildlife trade, in particular, the poaching of ivory. Now, some of you might know this, but the international wildlife trade is one of the most lucrative criminal trades in the world. People have a tendency to think of it as poaching and it's a local person poaching. In reality, it's run by crime syndicates, just like trafficking of women is or trafficking of guns is. And so what we needed was to convince the local community that poaching had to be an issue that was owned, anti-poaching had to be an issue that was owned by the local communities. And this is where the faith institutions came in. And it was incredibly powerful. They made a stand against it. We created all kinds of liturgies. It's still very active. It's an interfaith movement in East Africa in particular. And then the feedback that came to me again, and this is one of my wonderful experience working with faiths, is that the questions never stop, right? And so the feedback was, well, this is where the source is. This is where all the poaching is happening. But why is it happening? And are you working with faith leaders where it happens? Where does the demand for all this ivory come from? And so that allowed us to create a program, particularly in Thailand, to work with all the senior Buddhist monks in Thailand, monks and female and nuns in Thailand. And so the reason why we chose to work in Thailand is because the way poaching works is interesting. So ivory internationally is actually illegal. It falls under the Convention of International Treaty on Endangered Species. So you're not supposed to actually legally source ivory. So all this illegal ivory would end up in Thailand. And because Thailand has a legal domestic market for ivory, they would relabel this African ivory into domestic ivory and then take it to China, and all of it was going to China. And so we were, because it's so lucrative, it greases so many palms, it is the source of income for so many people and profit for very few people. What ended up happening was WWF and other partners were really struggling to get the government to change its policy on domestic ivory. But having faith leaders come in, and what these Buddhist monks and leaders did was basically say that being part of any part of the ivory trade meant that you weren't living up to Buddhist ideals. And that went so much further than what I'd expected. I thought at most they would say something soft, like, Buddhists should not be poaching ivory, should not be selling or buying ivory. But actually what they ended up saying was that they would not consider you as a good Buddhist if you were any part of this trade. And they ended up holding a merit-making ceremony for the elephants in Africa. So merit-making ceremonies, for those of you who might know, is something you do usually for your parents or for your grandparents. It's something that is done for the esteemed members of your family, so that when they die, their rebirth is safe, right? Their rebirth happens in a place that all your aspirations go towards, right? That it's a good place, it's caring, it's loving. And they decided to do a merit-making ceremony for elephants. And this happened right during the CITES convention in Thailand at that time, which meant that the Thai government actually for the first time took a stand and said they will ban the local domestic ivory trade, and they will transform it so that this cannot happen anymore. Now, people have asked me again and again, people have a tendency, whenever I say I work with faith leaders, they think that what that means is that I sit with faith leaders and we meditate together on how we should protect the planet. And now I'm not saying that doesn't happen. That happens quite a lot. However, for me, as someone who was trained to work in field conservation, at the end of the day, if the change isn't happening on the ground, it's irrelevant, right? Even as a Buddhist, if we are not embodying what we meditate on, what is the point? What is the point, right? So for me, what is really significant about working with faiths has been that there is an actual transformation on the ground. So do they really walk the walk? The example I've been looking at recently has been about the fossil fuel divestment. So what's interesting is that the largest group of divestment pledges has come from faith communities. 1/3 of all divestment right now globally is actually coming from all these faith institutions who have investments, trillions of dollars of investments that they're pulling out from oil mining and gas. So it really matters that we work with faith leaders. It really matters that we engage people at the core and at the point, the intersection of where our behavior and our spiritual values are. And it's the reason why I ended up creating the Loka Initiative, which Roshi mentioned. So the Loka Initiative is based at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The reason why I chose to be at a university is because after some time working with faith leaders, the two questions I got the most again and again were, can you create a safe space where we as people of faith can meet with scientists, policymakers, and solution architects to design the projects we want to lead? We don't want someone else to lead the projects for us. We want to lead the projects, but we need a safe space where our spiritual values are intact, our worldviews are respected, but we are able to engage the best science and solution that's out there to develop these solutions, right? These projects. And then the second request I got again and again was, can you advise us as we design these projects? And so it seemed to me the best place to try and create a program like that would be at a university where there are tons of guides. There are tons of graduate students and professors that can guide people of faith as they are designing their projects, and that are also really interested in having dialogue across boundaries. One of the interesting things about doing this work is that what I've learned is that you cannot begin to do any kind of work that engages disparate communities without having to, in some sense, switch off that button, that your ego button, right? And so my criteria for who works with me is people who can actually switch that ego button off, because a lot of people that are coming in are actually heads of their own religious groups. A lot of scientists that are coming in are heads of their own programs. And so we have to find a neutral space where we come in with this kind of desire, this real commitment and motivation to protect the planet and to protect all living beings on the planet. So our mission is really simple. Unlike a lot of organizations where, in many ways I was hemmed by their mandate. The mission for us is we support faith-led institutions faith-led efforts all around the world, right? We work in particular on capacity building with 3 communities. And so, and we do, so the first thing I should say is we do a lot of convenings. And so I wanted to put this out there. These are all very dear friends of mine, and we all were able to come together. So you're seeing Roshi herself, you're seeing Juanita Cabrera Lopez, who heads the Mayan League, Nana Furman, who is one of the greatest eco-Muslim leaders here in the United States, and Tamchu, who has a community called Dharmadatta and works with international nuns around the world and is designing a lot of new environmental projects. So, you know, one of the things that Loka does is affirms the leadership of women, but also people of color. We have a rule that 40% of all our speakers have to be Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And then in the closed capacity building that we do, the first group that we work with that people are astonished by are we work with evangelicals. Loka convenes and does capacity building of evangelicals around the world. We work with church leaders. We just recently did communications training for church leaders from 25 countries on climate change in particular. One of the most interesting things is this desire for them. They have a deep desire to push back that evangelicals are anti-climate science, because these evangelicals that I work with are desperately trying to address climate issues for their communities, right? Addressing the issue of water scarcity in Africa, addressing the issue of pollution and safe drinking water in the United States, you know, addressing the issue of indigenous rights in the Amazon and South America and so on. The second group that we work with is indigenous peoples. And so this is a perfect time for me to plug that we have an event coming up August 9th to 11th, which is convening indigenous speakers, indigenous moderators, indigenous elders around the issue of sustenance, food, water, medicine, sovereignty, and spirit. And that it's really important that we work with the tribes in the land that we inhabit in Wisconsin. So we work particularly with the Ho-Chunk Nation and with the Menominee Nation. And then the third group, of course, is who I started off my faith journey with, which is the Koryug monasteries and nunneries in the Himalayas. Now, I wanted to take a moment and talk about all the things I've learned working with faith leaders and the being able to reclaim the complexity of the issues working with faith leaders. And I think this was the greatest gift I received. I was on Time just the other day, and this was the headline on Time magazine, which I think of as one of the most, like, you know, middle of the road, never going to say anything radical, never going to say anything anti-capitalist. But this was the headline in Time magazine. And this is where we are right now, right? The top 1% of Americans have taken 50 trillion from the bottom 90%. And so we are in a situation where the top trillionaires and billionaires are able to make money out of the suffering, have always done so, but it's never been more apparent than today. You know, both Roshi and Heather talked about this, how race really matters when we talk about environmental issue. And there's a reason why, because race is the most significant predictor of where people are actually going to, where the contamination is in the United States. If you're Black, Indigenous, a person of color, you're 3 times more likely to be living near a waste dump in the United States, right? You are much less likely to receive the aid you need. You're much less likely to have funding be diverted to your requirements, whether it's cleanup, whether it's protection of environmental issues. Now, why is that? So these 2 images that I wanted to put forward, I really wanted to put forward because I think one of the things we have a tendency as humans, particularly in America, is to not see ourselves as part of history, right? We have a tendency to really center our moment. We are very focused on the future and we're very focused on the now. We're pretty bad about thinking about what happened yesterday. However, when you think about the history of the last 500 years, which interestingly coincides perfectly with when the carbon started to rise and when we started actually producing so much carbon in the atmosphere that it's led to climate change, right? So exact same timeline. What was going on globally? What was going on was this deep extraction of resources, not just from people, but also from the planet, right? We had a mechanism, colonialism, that allowed Europeans in particular, to go to other parts of the world and to extract all the riches they needed. And that for them included people. And they allowed, a kind of, what can I say, a kind of model. They designed a model very deliberately that actually made money off of the suffering of people. That was what colonialism was. That it was the rest of the people, all brown people and Black people, that would suffer so that white people in Europe could actually live a really good life. That's bottom line colonialism. And we have a tendency to think that's over, right? We have terms like neo-colonial. It's very unpleasant for a lot of people when we bring up this history. And people really, especially in this country, when you think about what happens with when we're trying to take down statues, how people react, right? Like there is this real threat to us bringing up colonialism. The thing is, for someone like me who travels all around the world and works with local communities and then has to jump into boardrooms and then has to present in front of, large corporations and so on, is that it's actually so apparent it's alive. Colonialism is alive. It's alive and kicking and thriving. And the reason why this matters is because the system is functioning as it was designed. It's functioning so that the powerful can always make money off of the suffering of the weak or the less powerful, or of the people that have been all this time decentralized and subjugated, right? And so one of the reasons why it's so important that we talk about what happens for us as willing or unwilling participants in capitalism, right, in the market, is that we understand that this is the system. Now, I love using this image because to me, this represents everything about neoliberalism in particular. So what's neoliberalism? It's basically capitalism with no rules, right? It's what's happened in the last 30 years. It's globalization. It's basically all these people saying the rules apply to everyone but us. We want no regulation. We want no government. We basically want all the trade barriers to come down. And what it does is create robber barons, right? So what happens when we go to grocery stores? What happens, especially when you go to the cereal aisle and they're like, I don't know, 100 cereals? We freeze. We think that it is so, it's just so much diversity of choice, so many names, so many kinds of sugar, so many kinds of products. But this image tells you that in reality, there are 10 companies that own everything in that store. So what has colonialism and capitalism given us? What it's given us is the opposite of what nature gives us. It's given us a lack of diversity. It's given us a system where it confuses us. It makes us feel that we are the problem as individual consumers, right? That it's a really interesting abuse tactic. It's like the it's just the greatest form of gaslighting, really, to tell the consumer that you are the problem. And the fact that you are not recycling is what's causing this environmental crisis we're in today. When in reality, it's these companies that have designed capitalism in such a way that it benefits them and it benefits fewer and fewer people as time goes on. It is a design to create monopoly. And the interesting thing about monopolies, it begins here. It doesn't actually begin in the action, right? It really begins with our tendency to really, for example, to have individual consumers think that their identity is linked to a brand, right? What are we doing? Like we are taught through capitalism to believe that our identity is actually based on loyalty to some of these companies. How interesting is that? It's just fascinating to me. And it brings, when we think about this connection between colonialism, racism, capitalism, it really matters that we show up for people who have been historically excluded. It really matters that we do more than sit on our mats and meditate. We do more than be good scientists in our universities and our ivory towers. It matters that we put our bodies and show up for people who are basically historically and today being exploited to benefit the richest of the people, right? And so it's always interesting to me. So I will say one thing. I was in a conservation biology conference in Central America a few years ago, and it was sort of this big gathering of the greatest conservation biologists. And this young woman got up from the audience and asked the panel, and I was on the panel, whether Black Lives mattered to the conservation movement. And I was the only person who said yes. And it was fascinating to me that the other conservation scientists thought that it was a distraction rather than the key, rather than the real work. And this brings me back to why I brought up the issue of the paradigm and what Western education has done to us with dualism. Because what it's done to us is convinced us that we humans are not part of nature. You can have conservation biologists who've spent their entire 40-odd year career working on biodiversity preservation and protection and not think that diversity in humans is relevant, right? Why is that? It's because they genuinely believe that humans are out of nature. So we have to understand that when we talk about diversity of nature, we humans are part of nature. It really matters that we reflect and protect diversity in our communities as well. Now, again, like eco-anxiety, this term didn't exist when I was in school, and I wish it did. But for those of you who know Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, you know just what a towering intellect she is, right? So she came up with this term, which basically says you cannot address race, class, or gender individually, that these are all interconnected to each other, and that they actually are used in ways to discriminate and disadvantage against each other. So, race is always posited. You have plenty of people on Twitter when you talk about race saying, but it's class, right? We're once again falling into that trap of dualism by doing that. And so it's really important to us, those of us who have gathered here today, like worried about these issues, that we use this lens. It's so empowering for us when we understand these are all interconnected and interdependent, and that it doesn't matter actually, and I get in trouble all the time with my conservation friends when I say this, it doesn't matter if you are working directly on climate or directly on biodiversity conservation or on food insecurity or on providing COVID help for your local communities, because these are all interconnected. And as long as we're addressing one of these issues, we're addressing all of these issues. Now, I want to leave you with a few sort of lessons I've learned along the way as a spiritual person working with faith communities and also as a scientist. So the first thing, the most important thing, is that the Earth is a closed system. What do I mean by that? So basically the Earth is made up of an atmosphere which surrounds it, right? A geosphere, which is all the land, and then a hydrosphere, which is all the water. Nothing naturally really leaves this. Maybe someone's ego creates a rocket and they all leave it, but for the most part, nothing really naturally leaves it. Maybe an occasional meteor comes in, that's it. All of us who are in this, whether we like each other, don't like each other, whether we vote differently, whether we are really ultra rich or ultra poor, all of us live and die on this planet. Everything that is made up in the hydrosphere, in the atmosphere, in the geosphere exists, stops existing, decomposes, and then exists again, right? We are literally living in interdependence. We literally dissolve into each other over and over and over again in different forms. And so as a Buddhist and as a scientist, to me, this is the principle that really can bring all of us together. Ultimately, there isn't escaping this beautiful globe. And what happens in one part of the globe affects everything else, affects all of us. We think we are safe in the places we live in, but the reality is someone else's suffering across the planet is going to affect us because the Earth is a closed system. The second thing is, it's fascinating. Nature always designs around the principles of diversity, interdependence, and decentralization. Nature is the greatest community organizer we've ever seen, so everywhere we go, it's incredibly diverse. Every ecosystem that's resilient is resilient because of the diversity. Every interspecies interaction we see, there is an entire principle of interdependence around it. Look at bees. If bees were to disappear today, over 30% of our agriculture would collapse in the next 3 months, period. That would be it, right? So it's really important that we see not only are these principles that matter to us socially or as Buddhists or as practitioners or people of faith, but that actually that's what nature is teaching us again and again. That's what nature embodies. And then the final one. I've been in the environmental and climate movement now for over 20 years. And especially in the last 5 years, there's been this really strong surge around the topic of the Anthropocene. I have to say it's led by white men. And this idea that humans, basically are the problem. We created the climate crisis. We've created the environmental crisis. But what underlies the Anthropocene and this concept of the Anthropocene is that we're basically pests on the planet, right? As a Bhutia person and as a Buddhist, I really want to push back on this idea. If you think of our timeline, a human existent timeline, what we've gone through in the last 500 years is just a blip in that radar. And in that entire timeline, we have, for the most part, managed to live in harmony with nature. And it's really important to us that we reclaim our space in nature as a beneficial, as a codependent, right? As a interdependent, that being the sort of the basis of the relationship. However, the idea that we don't matter or that we are terrible is terribly damaging, especially for the next generation of youth that I see coming up who are experiencing eco-anxiety at levels that we never did, right? Because they literally see the world that they're inheriting. And then being told that we are the problem constantly is really damaging. And so I want to leave us with this idea that we were born in the body we're in with the identity we have for a reason. And whether that reason was created by someone up there, whether that reason was created through, let's say like a complex multiplicity of factors in nature coming in, or whether we, in some sense, maybe actualized our aspiration pre-life, right? Any of those could be true, but that there is the strong possibility we came with purpose. And part of that purpose could be that we came to heal this relationship amongst ourselves, with nature, and with the planet. And it's really important to us that we keep the space for that, because the road is long and it is arduous. For those of us who are doing environmental and social work, it's an arduous road, and we are all exhausted. But when you reclaim that relationship with the universe and with nature as being a sacred one, it changes how the load that we carry, and it makes it lighter. Thank you.
Oh, Dekila, thank you so much. And, ending that talk on this imperative to heal, very much in line with what Heather was addressing. And also pointing to the sacredness of purpose and this time. This is something in the socially engaged Buddhist training that Joanna Macy addressed in a really such a powerful way. I'm so grateful you ended your sharing this morning on that note. Dekila, what I'd like us to do is now to take questions. And so if you would raise your hand, particularly if you feel shy, because the best part for me is when, you kind of step out of the quietness and bring, your inquiry to all of us. So, by the way, Dekila, thank you for also addressing the issue of capitalism, which, one of our people questioned earlier. Okay, Randall, there you are. And I'm going to ask, let's be concise because we only have 10 minutes for this. We want to complete on time. So just go to essence, Randall. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. Well, the speeches answered a lot of my questions and addressed some of my comments. But one was the the concept of, what can we learn today from history, the history of culture, of cultural change in the past, that can apply to how to move forward and cross those boundaries today. And we're looking at some excellent examples of things that are being done today. But if you look at the history of man anthropologically, of the different kinds of social political systems that we've had for thousands of years, how much have we evolved? And are there things that are unique in our culture, capitalist society today, so forth? How are they different from the past cultures that seem to be much more cultural and psychologically closed systems? And our last speaker was talking about, the earth is a closed physical system, but there's a psychological system as well. And there's psychological evolution that has gone on. And how has that changed, if it has? And what can we learn from that? And when I boil it down to myself, it comes down to, how does this relate to compassion for people who are being asked to change and give up, and fear, anxiety, and all that, to break through that and release that, to be able to create and participate with some of these changes moving forward. It's like, so are we really reinventing the wheel here? What can we learn from time past, cultural, that will help us understand ourselves and our context of where we're really at? It seems to me, just my observation, is that it's the same thing all over again. So that's what I just want to put out.
Thanks so much, Randall. Dekila.
So I think what I thought of when you were asking your question, Randall, was we have a tendency to think of evolution as a straight linear line, right? Most of us, when we think about evolution, it's like, oh, that's what we imagine evolution to be. And the reality is evolution is actually incredibly jagged. There are all kinds of valleys in there. We go back and forth like crazy. I mean, whether we're talking at a cellular level, whether we're talking as cultures, whether we're talking, in terms of adaptation to ecological niches or to, threats. The way we adapt and the way we evolve is there's just a lot of movement backwards and forwards. And the other thing I always find really interesting about how we evolve at a cellular level, it's honestly been a source of great courage for me, providing courage for me, has been that evolution at a cellular level often happens because cells misbehave. It's not, evolution doesn't happen because a cell is just going on, doing its daily business. It happens because the cells start misbehaving and kind of playing in the periphery and playing in the areas it's not supposed to. What that tells me is that change is never linear. Change is never easy. When we think about progress as a society, that there are going to be many pitfalls, and there are going to be plenty of people in power who don't want to give up that power, that are going to do everything they can. I mean, look at the example of Exxon. Now we find out that their scientists were actually ahead of the curve when it came to climate science, knew in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and then manipulated this incredible miscommunication, right? Misinformation technique to confuse the rest of us. They were actually one of the biggest funders of the recycling movement, once again, to put the onus on the individual rather than taking responsibility for their own actions. And the fact that they had created this entire, product that was destroying the planet. And so to me, I think one of the things is taking that pressure off that we need to evolve every second. And that when we see a failure, taking the pressure off that failure means we are doomed and we have failed. Understanding that there are going to be places where we move 5 steps forward and maybe walk 10 steps back and get to move 6 steps forward. And actually the change was just that 1 step, And so I think allowing us to experience that means that we don't have to be despairing all the time when we see the sorrow and we see the tragedy and we see all the missed opportunities for growth, right? I think it really helps to have that as a worldview and as a lens. The second thing I want to say is that to me, you know, what has been amazing, the word resilience can sometimes be used in a way where, especially my Black and Indigenous friends sometimes will say to me, that's so often used to not allow people to thrive, which is kind of like, oh, you're suffering, but you're resilient, and so you're okay, right? However, there's something so interesting about resilience to me. It means exactly the same thing ecologically, sociologically, or psychologically. It's that ability to bounce back. And especially in psychology, there is this very clear description, which is that it doesn't mean you go back to the way things were. It just means you get to withstand the situation you're in much better. And I think when we think about what we learn from history, to me, the most useful thing we can learn about is how did people build their resilience? How did people survive? How have Black people thrived in this country despite, my God, the bloody history, right? How are Native Americans in America still able to reclaim their identity despite a genocide, right? How are refugees, how are, you know, single mothers, how are single mother immigrants that come to the country still able to thrive and protect their children? You know, when you look at suffering, what you see is that we as humans have this inherent ability to bounce back from adversity. And that despite the hardest situations are able to climb out of those holes that other people put us in. And I think learning from that, as opposed to all the billionaires who love to tell us how they would survive the climate apocalypse, all these New York Times bestselling men that love to write their op-eds, what I would love to learn from, who I want to love to learn from, are the Native Americans and the Black women leaders and the immigrant women who are coming in as refugees, because they have demonstrated evolution in a way at a level that no one else has, right? So, okay, I think that I'm going to stop there.
Okay.
I saw Sandy says, thank you, Dekila, for speaking truth to power. I thank you so much. Wonderful question. Also your response, extraordinary. I'm going to ask now for Barbara, if you really go to essence, because I'd love to take the next three questions if we can before we have to conclude for lunch or our break. Barbara, if you would unmute.
Yes, thank you so much, Dekila. I really don't have a question I want to pose to the group now, because there are 14,000 questions that you have touched on that have been on my mind for a very long time. I just want to express my gratitude for you connecting the dots for so many things that are of interest to me, for helping us to see the ways that we can join with people who may look like our enemies, i.e. people of different faiths who may see climate change differently than we do. That's really inspirational. And so I'm very grateful, and I think you'll be hearing from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Kadiha. Kadiha, you can unmute yourself. Welcome.
Oh, hello. I don't have any questions, but I would like to say that the environmental crisis is a very, very concerning thing for me, because I'm an environmentalist and I'm also a WWF intern as well. And what people see, the earth is going through a crisis, right? And people don't see it, take it seriously as they're supposed to take it seriously. But, this crisis is a very, 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 very concerning thing. And as an environmentalist, I would say to take this very seriously, because people don't see how this thing impacts globally. I mean, for example, if I, throw something in an ocean and it impacts a lot of sections of the oceans, right? You throw plastic, animals get caught in that. It's very concerning for me. So people should take this very seriously.
Thank you,
I
Pasha.
don't see enough action at all. So thank you for letting me speak.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Katya, I'm curious, where are you right now geographically? She disappeared. Okay. I'm not sure where. I was curious. I see one more question from Kasha, and I'm going to again ask you. We
I'm
just have.
sorry, I just unmuted myself. I'm from Pakistan.
Okay.
It's actually, I'm in Asia. It's Pakistan. I live in Pakistan.
Thank you for being with us so much. Kasha, or that's the name on your postage stamp.
Thank you, Dekila. Thank you very much for your work. When you're working with faith-based communities who have an existential belief in open systems, so reincarnation, transcendentalism, how do you work with them to connect the idea that we are an actual closed system and to be open to the here and now is as important as the belief system of tomorrow in the next life? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Dekila.
Thank you, Kasha. I feel like that question, I mean, that's what I spent the last 12 years trying to figure out, working with my own community, right? So, I mean, at a practical level, one of the things that I push back quite a lot on is the idea of reincarnation being an escape. You know, even in my community in Sikkim, a lot of Buddhists just feel very relaxed about climate change and environmental issues because the idea is, oh, well, we'll die, but we'll come back. And, you know, it's sort of this idea that we somehow get to escape the planet in some way, right? And what I like to remind them about is that, well, reincarnation is a closed system too, isn't it? Unless you are one of among trillions and you get to, you know, ascend as a Buddha, the reality is we're coming back again and again, and things are getting worse each time we come back. And so even if people might not care so much what happens to other people around them, they should care what happens to them in the next life. Isn't that, especially for those of us who are born in Buddhism, we spend an inordinate amount of time praying for our next life, you know, trying to secure a good or better life than the one we have. And so it's really important to put that in perspective, that you're not going to have a very good life, no matter how rich you are, no matter, you know, whether you're born in the perfect circumstances or not, if the earth is just on fire all around you. I think the other part too is it really matters to adapt to the argument you're making to the people that you're speaking with. Because when it comes to Buddhism, for me, and other open systems, as you described, I think the thing that really affects most people is this realization that they have been praying and meditating on compassion, but not embodying it, right? And by that, I mean, we have a tendency to really, you know, kind of dedicate a part of our life to generating and creating more compassion, you know, and by doing so, what we've done is in some senses also lived, it's sort of kind of brought dualism in, because then what we've done is created spaces where the compassion is and created spaces where it isn't, where it's allowed to thrive and where it isn't. And so this brings me back to my constant demand to the Buddhist community, which is show up. You know, if that means you're spending less time in front of the mat, that's fine by me. You know, spend time less on your mat and spend more time in the community protecting people and protecting nature and protecting all the species, because there isn't that dualism that this is practice and this isn't, makes no sense. It's all practice, right? Isn't it? And what is the point of practice but that we embody? Isn't even the word we use, practice, is that we practice interdependence, we practice compassion, we practice purification for what? So that we naturally embody. Isn't that what Buddha means? And so the fact that we've introduced this dualism and created a separation between practice and actual embodiment, right? And that we're kind of not only distancing, we're postponing that moment where we embody. And in many ways, you know, it's fascinating in Buddhism how often people look down on people like me who are activists. Kind of like, you know, we are less, it's assumed, we have been told again and again that we are less realized because we're activists, right? We are wasting all our time. We should have spent those 20 years being a practitioner. I can tell you, my own Rinpoches and Lamas tell me that. They think that I should have done a 3-year retreat a long time ago, and that's the pressure I get. You know, and then I always have to come back with all kinds of scriptures. And Roshi's laughing because she's seen me go through this and has gone through this too. I think there's also this very interesting thing that we haven't brought up yet, but I bet is going to come up in Rhonda's thing, is also about the gendered aspect of it. How many of us are Buddhist women who are working
Yes.
on the embodiment and not just the practice? How many of us have chosen to not lead sitting on a mat, but to actually be in the community? And so I really want to put it back to you saying that, you know, this idea that just because we chose, you know, we chose this kind of lineage where the emphasis is on understanding impermanence or understanding emptiness doesn't mean that we abdicate from the responsibility to embodying what we're learning. It's one and the same thing.
Forgive me, Dekila. Thank you, my dear. Exactly. And in that regard, I just have to thank you also for bringing these 3 features into focus: diversity, interdependence, and decentralization in relation to this vision of and view of intersectionality. So this was a powerful and uplifting morning. 2 extraordinary women. I am so grateful for what both Heather and you have offered, and also for your friendship, and also that you speak so directly to the truth of suffering, but also you point toward and have lived solutions that model possibilities for our future. So we are going to then take a break now until 2 p.m. Mountain Time. And then at 2 o'clock, Kriti Kanko, Dr. and Sensei Kriti Kanko, she's a Zen priest and a climate scientist, and doing extraordinary work around the issue of climate grief. And so I ask you to please show up on time. I would really appreciate that, as I'm sure Kriti will. And then our afternoon will conclude with lawyer Rhonda McGee, who is my close friend, and she's going to dive directly into issues related to the environment, race, and justice. Thank you, dear friends. We'll see you at 2.